The wind was a thief. It stole the moisture from her lips, the warmth from her skin, the last of the hope from her marrow. It scoured the plains, a vast, indifferent expanse of cracked earth and brittle grass that stretched until the horizon bled into a mercilessly pale sky. Alara walked into it, a ghost against the desolation, her husband's wagon a lumbering, skeletal burden behind her. The oxen were long dead. She and the horse, Balthazar, were all that remained of the pulling power, and the animal's strength was a fading ember. Inside the wagon, beneath a patched canvas cover that snapped and tore in the ceaseless gale, lay Lyra. Alara's world had shrunk to this single, agonizing focus, the faint whisper of her sister's breath. Each step was a prayer, each crest of a barren hill a fresh stab of despair. When she saw the splinter of smoke, a fragile gray thread against the endless blue, she did not dare to believe it. Could be a mirage, another cruelty of the sun and the dust. But it persisted, unwavering. With a strength she did not possess, she tugged on the harness, her cracked hands raw against the leather. Balthazar, sensing the shift, gave a low groan and pulled. They staggered towards the smoke, a broken procession chasing a phantom. The ranch was not a haven. It was a fortress, a low-slung cabin of dark. Weathered timber and a solid-looking barn were surrounded by a sturdy fence, all of it hunkered down as if bracing against the wind's assault. A man stood by the barn, his form broad and unmoving, watching their approach. He held a rifle not aimed but ready. He was part of the landscape, weather-beaten, hard, and unyielding. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through Alara's exhaustion. This was the end of the line. There was nothing beyond this man but the same wasteland that had consumed everything else. She halted a dozen yards from him, the silence between them broken only by the wind's mournful cry and Balthazar's heaving gasps. The man's face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. The silence was an accusation. "Water," Alara rasped, her voice a dry rasp. "Please, for my sister." His gaze flickered from her face to the wagon, his suspicion a palpable thing. He saw her tattered dress, the desperation etched into the lines around her eyes, the way her body swayed with fatigue. He had seen this story before. Drifters, beggars, trouble. "She's in the wagon?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Alara nodded, too weary to form another word. He took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving her, wary as a wolf. He gestured with the rifle barrel towards the back of the wagon. "Show me." It was not a request. Alara fumbled with the rope tying the canvas flap, her fingers clumsy and numb. She pushed it aside, revealing the cramped, shadowed interior. On a pallet of old blankets lay Lyra, a small, still form, her face pale as wax, her chest barely rising. The man stopped, his boots sinking into the dust just behind Alara. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold dread coiling in her own stomach. He was waiting for the plea, the performance of misery. Alara looked down at her sister, at the blue-tinged lips and the flutter of eyelids too weak to open. A wave of protective fury, fierce and useless, rose within her. She would not let this man's judgment be the last thing Lyra felt in this world. She turned her head slightly, her voice hollow but clear. "She's too faint to beg." The man's posture shifted. He moved past her, his presence filling the small space. He leaned over the wagon bed, his large hands gripping the wooden sides. Alara held her breath, watching his silhouette against the harsh light. He reached down and lifted the edge of the thin blanket covering Lyra, peering into the shadows where the child lay curled and silent. For a long moment he was utterly still. Then, a sharp intake of breath. He stared, not with suspicion, but with a dawning visceral horror that transformed his hard features. The pretense of the hardened rancher fell away, replaced by the raw shock of a man witnessing the absolute edge of life. He saw not a beggar's trick, but the quiet, terrible truth of starvation. He straightened up slowly, his gaze meeting Alara's. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that felt like a shared burden. He gave a single, curt nod, not to her, but to a decision he had just made. Bring her inside. The cabin was a world of shadows and the scent of wood smoke, pine, and leather. It was small, meticulously sparse, a place built for function, not comfort. Silas. He had offered his name with the same blunt economy he did everything else, had carried Lyra inside and laid her on his own cot without a word. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that belied the horror Alara had seen in his eyes. He worked, and Alara watched, a spectator in the fight for her own sister's life. He ladled lukewarm broth, thin and clear, and patiently, drop by drop, pressed it to Lyra's lips with a small spoon. He bathed her face with a damp cloth, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Alara sat on a low stool by the hearth, a cup of water held in her trembling hands. The warmth from the fire seeped into her bones, a sensation so foreign she felt it as a kind of pain. For days, she had been the sole protector, the only force standing between Lyra and death. Now she was useless. This silent, formidable man had taken her place, and she felt a profound, unnerving sense of displacement. She was a guest here, a stray, her presence conditional. He had not asked for her story. He had not offered words of comfort. He simply acted. He fed the fire, checked on Lyra, and moved about the small space as if Alara were not there at all. This quiet industry was its own form of judgment. It demanded something in return. Gratitude was not enough. It was a currency for beggars. Dignity required more. The next morning, while Silas was outside and Lyra slept a deeper, more peaceful sleep than she had in weeks, Alara found her purpose. She rose from the stool, her joints stiff and aching, and began to clean. She swept the floor, her movements slow but steady. She washed the few dishes with a careful hand, handling the heavy earthenware as if it were precious. She found his mending basket, a jumble of thread and worn-out fabric. In it was a work shirt, the sleeve nearly torn from the shoulder. She sat by the fire, the needle unfamiliar but welcome in her hand. Her own mother had taught her to sew, a lifetime ago, in a soft, green world that no longer seemed real. The stitches were small and tight, a neat, straight line pulling the torn fabric together. It was a small, quiet act, but it was an answer to his unspoken question. I am not a burden. I can contribute. I can mend what is broken. When Silas returned, smelling of the cold morning air and the sweat of his labor, he stopped in the doorway. His eyes went from the clean floor to the tidy hearth, then settled on the shirt in her hands. He stood there for a long moment, his face giving nothing away. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She expected him to take it from her, to dismiss her effort as inadequate. Instead, he simply unstrapped his gun belt and hung it on a peg by the door. He walked to the stove and began to make coffee, the silence stretching, but feeling different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the sight of her needle, rising and falling, a quiet testament in the firelight. That evening, he placed an extra blanket on the floor for her, near the hearth. He said nothing when he did it. He did not have to. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by work and weather. Lyra slowly returned to the world of the living, her pallor giving way to a fragile pink, her silence replaced by a child's quiet curiosity. She would watch Silas with wide, solemn eyes as he carved small figures from scraps of wood. A bird, a horse, a wolf, leaving them on the edge of her cot without comment. For Alara, the days were a series of tasks that anchored her to this new reality. She tended the small vegetable patch behind the cabin, her hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. She learned to milk the single, bad-tempered goat, to bake bread in the cast-iron stove, to read the sky for signs of rain. She and Silas rarely spoke more than a few necessary words. The wood is low. The fence needs mending. Lyra ate today. Their communication lived in the spaces between words, in shared labor and quiet observation. She learned the landscape of his face, The way a muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was troubled. The faint lines that appeared around his eyes when he watched Lyra attempt her first unsteady steps. She learned he had come here years ago, a man escaping a past he never spoke of, and had carved this life from the unforgiving land with nothing but his own 2 hands. He was a man made of the same silence and resilience as the plains themselves. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray, Elara found him in the barn, sharpening an axe. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hay. She stood in the doorway, holding the mended shirt she had just finished washing and folding. It was his favorite, softened with wear, the patch on the sleeve a testament to her presence. She started, her voice feeling too loud in the cavernous space. I wanted to thank you. He did not stop the rhythmic slide of the whetstone against the steel blade. For what? For Lyra. For everything. He finally looked up, his gaze steady. A person does what needs to be done. It was not a dismissal. It was a statement of his creed, the simple, profound code he lived by. He saw a need and he met it. He had seen 2 souls at the brink, and he had pulled them back. It was that simple and that complex. In his world, words were fleeting. Action was truth. She understood then that his silence was not a lack of feeling, but a different language entirely, one she was slowly learning to speak. She placed the folded shirt on a clean crate and left him to his work, the sound of the sharpening steel following her, a promise of protection against the coming storm. The wind rose, howling around the corners of the cabin, but for the first time since she'd lost everything, Elara felt the solid walls around her and was not afraid of the storm outside. The peace was as fragile as a new leaf. It was shattered by the arrival of 3 men on horseback. They were not from the wasteland. They were from the town, an entire day's ride east, their clothes carrying the scent of cheap whiskey and self-importance. Elara saw them from the vegetable patch, a dark knot of riders growing larger against the pale earth, and a cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. She called for Lyra, her voice sharp with an urgency the child had never heard. Lyra ran to her, and Elara hurried her inside the cabin, her mind racing. These were not men seeking water. They rode with the kind of lazy arrogance that signaled ownership of the world and everything in it. Silas met them at the fence, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He was a single, unmoving figure against the 3 of them. Elara watched from the sliver of a gap in the cabin's curtain, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The leader, a man with a florid face and a cruel twist to his mouth named Barlow, did the talking. Heard you took in some strays, Silas? Barlow called out, his voice slick with insinuation. A woman and a kid. Not like you to be so charitable. My business is my own, Silas replied, his voice flat and dangerous. See, that's where you're wrong, Barlow sneered, leaning forward on his saddle horn. When a man like you, a man who keeps to himself for a reason, suddenly starts playing house, it becomes the town's business. We have laws. Decency, he spat on the ground. We think she's a whore run-in from something, and we think you're hiding her. Or maybe you just bought her. The accusation hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Elara felt a wave of nausea. They were stripping her of the dignity she had so carefully, so painstakingly rebuilt. She was, to them, nothing but property or a problem. She's under my protection, Silas said, and the words were like stones dropped into a deep well. The 2 men with Barlow shifted, their hands moving closer to their holsters. Is she now? Barlow's eyes glinted with malice. He dismounted, throwing his reins to one of his men. We'll just have a look for ourselves. See what kind of damaged goods you're harboring. He started for the gate. This was it. The moment the fragile sanctuary would be torn apart. Elara looked at Lyra, who was huddled by the hearth, her small face a mask of terror, the vulnerable creature she had pulled from the brink. The fierce, protective fury she had felt that first day returned, but this time it was not useless. It was a fire. She scanned the cabin. The rifle on the wall was Silas's. But by the stove, leaning against the wall, was the heavy iron poker, still warm from the morning fire. Her hand closed around it, felt solid, real, an extension of her will. As Barlow unlatched the gate, Silas raised his rifle, the click of the hammer echoing in the tense silence. "That's far enough." Barlow laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You won't shoot, Silas. You kill me, the whole town will burn you out. You're one man." He pushed the gate open and took a step inside. At that exact moment, the cabin door flew open. Alara stood there, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She held the iron poker like a weapon, its tip pointing directly at Barlow's chest. Her stance was not that of a victim. It was a challenge. "Get off this land," she said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. Barlow stopped, genuinely surprised. He had expected a cowering, grateful stray. He saw a woman of iron. He looked from her to Silas, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The confrontation was no longer simple. It was him against two people who would not break. He hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, his power evaporated. Silas took a step forward, his rifle now leveled steady and sure. The two men behind Barlow, seeing the shift, seeing the feral look in both Alara's and Silas's eyes, backed their horses away a few steps. The bluff had been called. Barlow, his face turning a deep, mottled red with fury and humiliation, backed away slowly. He remounted his horse, his eyes filled with poison. "This isn't over," he spat, before wheeling his horse around and riding away, his men scrambling to follow. Alara stood her ground until they were nothing but dust on the horizon. The poker grew heavy in her hand. She let it fall to her side, the strength draining out of her, replaced by a profound, shuddering relief. Silas lowered his rifle. He walked over and latched the gate, his movements deliberate, securing the boundary they had just defended together. He turned and looked at her, his expression one she had never seen before. It was not pity, not even just respect. It was a look of deep, quiet recognition, as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. The dust settled. The silence that returned was different from any that had come before. It was not empty, not tense, but deep and resonant, filled with the echo of the stand they had made. Lyra ran from the cabin and threw her arms around Alara's legs, burying her face in her mother's dress. Alara smoothed her hair, her own hands still trembling. Silas walked over, stopping before them. The hard lines of his face seemed to have softened. He looked from Alara's determined face to the child clinging to her, and the last of the walls around him seemed to crumble into dust. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her face, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness it made her breath catch in her throat. His calloused fingers barely grazed her temple, but a current passed between them, an understanding forged in shared peril and mutual defense. It was a confirmation of everything that had remained unspoken. The trust built stitch by stitch, the partnership grown in shared labor, the home they had defended side by side. "He was wrong," Silas said, his voice quiet, for her alone. "You are not damaged goods," he paused, his gaze holding hers. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." That night, the fire in the hearth burned brighter. They sat not in their usual separate spaces, but together at the small wooden table, sharing a meal. The cabin no longer felt like his space that she was merely occupying. Felt like theirs. A quiet resilience had taken root in the unforgiving soil, a bond formed not of words, but of action, of sacrifice, of two solitary people finding a shared strength against a harsh world. She had arrived as a ghost, a woman hollowed out by loss and begging for survival. But she was not that woman anymore. She had faced down the cruelty of the land and the cruelty of men, and she had not broken. She had found her footing, her voice, her power. Looking at Silas across the table, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the fire, Alara understood. Home was not a place you found. It was a place you built. It was a fortress made of courage and a hearth built of trust. Outside, the wind still howled its lonely song across the vast, dark plains. But here, Inside the solid walls of the life they were forging, there was warmth. There was safety. There was hope.